The first reading at Daily Mass this week has been taken from the prophet Hosea. Like Amos, from whom we read last week, he was active in the northern kingdom of Israel in the second half of the 8th century before the birth of Jesus. By that time, the country was falling into chaos. Undistinguished kings followed one another in rapid succession. Assyria was asserting its power and represented a serious threat. The life of the people was marked by forms of social and personal injustice, and above all by idolatry. Many were abandoning faith in the one God with whom their ancestors had made covenant, and were turning to the many gods that were worshipped in the religions of the surrounding peoples. One of the most distinctive things about Hosea's message is the way in which his own life experience becomes part of it. The woman he marries seems to have been a cult prostitute in some local pagan temple. She bears him 2 sons and a daughter, and then leaves him and returns to her former life. In instructing the prophet to take back his wife, God says that in doing so, he will become a living parable of God's willingness to take back his people. Today's reading suggests another image. When Israel was a child, God declares, "I loved him and called him out of Egypt and taught him to walk." The reference is to the Exodus and to the wandering of the people in the wilderness of Sinai. At that time, God says, "I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheek. I bent down to them and fed them." The image is full of tenderness and compassion. Like a parent, God cares about and is involved in the life of his children. The language used applies equally well to a father or a mother. In either case, the emphasis is on the unique bond that unites parent and child. If that is what God has been and is for Israel, how then can the people turn away from him, disregard his commandments, trample on the covenant? An ordinary parent at this point might well disown such a rebellious child, but not God. "My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender," he says. "I will not execute my fierce anger." It is not an easy thing to speak about God. He's beyond anything that we can think or imagine. Whatever we say about him is inadequate. And so we turn to images and symbols to evoke now this, now that aspect of his mystery. In the Bible, God is called my rock, my fortress, my shield. He's said to be like a great warrior, a powerful king, a caring shepherd. His voice is like the voice of thunder, or the roar of wind, or the quiet sound of a gentle breeze. He is like a compassionate father, a tender mother, a faithful and loving spouse. Jesus also uses images in speaking of God, the most central of which is that of the Father. Jesus experienced his relationship to God as being like that of a grown child to his Father. In teaching us the Our Father, he invites us to enter into the same kind of relationship with God that he had. God is not only our Creator and the Lord of human history, he's a loving parent involved in our lives, caring for us. Although the image of husband and wife in Hosea is tied up with the tragedy of infidelity, it comes back in a more positive way in the Old Testament book known as the Song of Songs. It is made up of a series of poems in which a bride and bridegroom express in the most intense and poetic of ways their mutual love and longing. The rabbinical tradition tended to read the book and its dominant image as an allegory for the relationship between God and his people. Christians, building on that tradition, relate the book's language to their understanding of the relationship of the risen Christ to both the church and the individual soul. The Song of Songs becomes a favorite book in the history of Christian monasticism. Monks and nuns read in it the story of their love affair with Christ. Whether male or female, they see themselves spiritually in the role of the bride, called to the most intimate of unions with him. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most attractive and influential of medieval monks, wrote some 85 sermons in which he used the Song of Songs to develop his teaching on the life of prayer and of union with God. Some 5 centuries later, Teresa of Avila, in her famous Interior Castle, related the last 3 of her stages of prayer to the process of a couple coming to know one another, becoming engaged, and finally entering into a marital union. Bernard and Teresa are but 2 among many Christian writers and mystics who've had recourse to the image of courtship and marriage in order to suggest the depths and the complexity of the intimacy with God into which we are called in Christ. Some mystics emphasize the total otherness of God and the inadequacy of all language to speak of him. More convinced of what they do not know than of what they do know, they opt for silence rather than words. As understandable as such an attitude is, it is not that of the Bible or of the great Christian tradition. We need to speak, however inadequately, to ourselves and to one another of God. To do so, we must use images. Images like those of a shepherd, a judge, a king, a loving parent, or a faithful spouse. God is all these things, but in ways that go beyond any experience we may have of them. Whatever their inadequacy, such images point to God, draw us along paths that lead us into the luminous darkness in which he dwells. Few of us know the intimate and intense life of prayer that was so much a part of the experience of Bernard and Teresa. And yet we too, if we are to be people of faith in the kind of world in which we live, need to have some experience of God. Such experience will come and go and pass through various stages. One thing we can be sure is that if it is authentic, it will contain some sense of the gratuitous and life-giving love that is evoked by the images of a tender and compassionate parent and of a faithful and loving spouse.